Gumba Malgun, Gumbanani Gianindu, Urugari State Library, Queensland Gu, which is good evening. It's good to see you and welcome friends to the State Library of Queensland. My name is Vicky McDonald and it's my great privilege to be the State Librarian and CEO of the State Library of Queensland. And on behalf of my colleagues, I'd like to welcome you here this evening to Research Reveals, our third event of this type this year. But let me begin by acknowledging Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their continuing connection to land and as custodians of stories for millennia. We are inspired by this tradition in our work to share and preserve Queensland's memory for future generations. I'd really like to extend a very warm welcome to the 2020 John Oxley Library Fellows, Associate Professor Kerrie Foxwell-Norton from Griffith University and Dr. Deb Anderson from Monash University. I'd also like to welcome our other special guest speakers for this evening, Professor Emeritus Ian McCallum from the University of Sydney, Diane Tart, Director of Marine Ecosystem Policy Advisors, and Peter McCallum, Coordinator of Mackay Conservation Group. And welcome everybody as well. And particularly it's nice and cosy in here this evening compared to how cold it is outside, which is very pleasant. The John Oxley Library Fellowship is proudly supported by donations through the Queensland Library Foundation. The fellowship is awarded annually, supporting researchers to uncover and reinterpret the histories held in our collections. As a leading cultural institution, seeking and sharing the diverse stories throughout Queensland history is an important responsibility and great privilege for State Library. Our research fellows play a valued and critical role in this endeavour. Deb and Kerrie's project is inspired by the story of Terry Ridgeway, who in 1966 quit her typing pool job in Brisbane and moved to a remote island on the Great Barrier Reef. Aged 19, she became the girl Robinson Crusoe, living solo and spending her time studying marine life, aiming to identify more than 1,500 species of reef fish. Deb and Kerrie's research shines a light on women who have been involved in the protection and conservation of the Great Barrier Reef, amplifying their perspectives and capturing a new side of the history of the reef, previously dominated by male voices and interpretation. Tonight, we're also excited to launch a special issue of Queensland Review, between Pride and Despair, Stories of Queensland's Great Barrier Reef and Wet Tropics. It's been edited by Kerrie and Professor Ian McCallum, and you'll find contributions from fellows Kerrie and Deb, as well as many leading contributors in the field. And the journal will be available for purchase following tonight's talk. I encourage everyone to participate in the conversation by sending your requests via Slido for the Q&A, as that will be part of tonight's event. And the details of how to link into Slido will pop up through the screen throughout the conversation. And the great thing about Slido is you can vote on the questions and they go up the ladder as they get more votes as well. So you can really participate in the whole process. Finally, I'd like to thank our donors for their enthusiastic support of both this award and State Library of Queensland. Donations to the Queensland Library Foundation allow State Library to offer a suite of fellowships to enable further research through the annual Queensland Memory Awards. And applications for fellowships are now open. So if you have an interest in interpreting the significant collections here at State Library, and particularly the John Oxley Library, I urge you to apply before the 15th of July. And full details of these awards and fellowships are available on our website. And I'm sure tonight's presentation will inspire you to think about a fellowship as well. Finally, I'd like to thank the Griffith Climate Action Beacon, who have funded this evening's drinks and canapes, and you'll hear more about those later. And for now, I'd like to welcome Kerrie, who's going to present the 2020 John Oxley Library Fellowship Research. So please welcome Kerrie.
Good evening, everyone. My acknowledgement first of the traditional owners here on Meanjin and the Turrbal and Yuggera people, and in other places, especially the places we have visited. We are here tonight on lands that were never ceded. These are stolen lands. My meditation on country is always about concrete and bitumen and how heavily this sits on the land and how this land and sea was 250 years ago, 60,000 years ago, and what we can learn from those people who have been here all that time. And tonight, especially, thinking about those grannies and aunties and sisters and how they can trace their civilisation back thousands of generations. And First Nations knowledge, of course, of the reef. My respect to elders, past and present, and thank you for sharing this country with me. And thanks to you all for being here tonight, those people who are here in person and those people online. We have much to share. We've not the time to do justice to every woman's story we've heard thus far, but we do have the time to take you through some of the connections in their stories and the serendipity that has brought us here. It is these moments in the magic of storytelling and unexpected moments of synergy that we will focus on tonight, with the caveat that the individual stories are indeed well enough on their own. But let's begin where this all started, with Terry Ridgeway. The project itself was born of serendipity. I was working with my colleague Libby Lester on an article that compared the role of media in two reef campaigns that bookend recent reef debates: the Save the Reef campaign of the 1960s and the Fight for the Reef campaign of the early noughties. I was reading Judith Wright's seminal A Coral Battleground, where she cites the faithful coverage of journalist Barry Wayne, the then Brisbane correspondent for The Australian, with his faithful coverage in bringing the Save the Reef campaign to the Australian public. The Save the Reef campaign leveraged the growing global environmental consciousness emblematic of that era. The 60s, free love, the music, the psychedelic drugs, the counter-revolution where boundaries were pushed on many fronts. And Rachel Carson's Silent Spring reached Australian shores. Astronauts captured the beauty and fragility of our planet in the famous Earthrise photo. The 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill reminded the world about the dangers of fossil fuel production, and ecology and its connected life systems was or did gain currency and legitimacy. All delivered by media, and in particular the growing global communications network that brought distant places closer to many and at a faster pace. But back to Barry. So I'm madly Googling Barry Wayne and happened upon this newspaper article written by Barry in 1966. The article appeared in a string of obscure, at least from my place in Australia, regional United States newspapers, like this one in the Mount Vernon Register News, Mount Vernon, Illinois, October 5, 1966. In it, Wayne reports on Terry Ridgeway, this bikini-clad nature nymph who lives alone on Northwest Island, the sea country now of Gureng, Gurang, Balalai, Tarabalang and Bunda peoples. And Terry goes snorkelling not to catch fish, but to observe them. He writes, 19, blue-eyed and blonde, sun-freckled face and deeply tanned figure would attract many a stare on a crowded beach. Wayne explains that Terry had left her typing pool job and study at a Brisbane commercial college to live on her own, to think and study fish. Keep in mind that this is mid-60s, deep in Joby Elkie-Peterson's Queensland, hardly a progressive time for women, though change is afoot. I'm reading this article and I'm wondering, and did wonder for about 5 years, who the hell is Terry Ridgeway? And what happened to her? To mine, she sounded so fierce, intelligent, so courageous for her time. And then this got me thinking, who are our other women of the reef? And what are their stories? And this project was born, and I was fortunate enough to recruit my co-fellow, an oral historian with a long history and passion for the reef and rainforest, Deb Anderson. I can still remember telling Deb about the project idea at a reef research retreat on Magnetic Island. Deb's eyes just lit up, and we've loved this project together ever since. Fast forward 5 years and Deb and I win the John Oxley Library Fellowship through the State Library of Queensland. Announcement of the Fellows for 2020 attracts a fair bit of media attention, and our fellowship is featured on the SLQ press releases, leading with a story about our Terry. In a reminder that we are not always as smart as we think, an ABC journalist, Shelley Lloyd, finds Terry by searching for Terry with an IE. Even more humbling given the spelling of my own name. And finally, after years of searching, I'm on the phone talking to her. And she is everything and more than I had imagined. And here she is. On the day I meet Terry in person, she tells me how she came to be on Northwest Island. In her words, I rode to every tourist resort on the coast along the reef before I left home, and I got off the train up in Cairns and just wandered down to the beach and commenced to just sleep in the sand dunes and have adventures and swim. And one day there was an answer from the post office from Heron Island saying I had a job, so I got back on the train and got off in Yeppoon and got on the barge and went out to Heron Island and to commence work as a barmaid on Heron Island. Back in 1965 it was, I believe, which is the first time I had ever put a mask and snorkel on, which was sort of like it. The first time I went in the water with a mask and snorkel on, that was it. A love affair. I never looked back. And I asked Terry, can you remember the day? What was it like? And she says, I think they had to drag me backwards out of the water at some point close on dusk. Of course, it was mesmerising. I was also always a good swimmer, and so I took to diving and became a really good free diver really quickly. I was very fit and strong. And she says there was a research station that shared the island, and all the boys and girls over at the research station were just fabulous. And I used to go out with them when they were specimen collecting, and I just hung on every word and every little thing I could learn. And I used to also go out and get fish for the table for the resort. And so I had every excuse to be in the water. As I didn't get off shift from the bar until 2 a.m, they used to leave one of the windows open in the research station so I could climb in the window and go into the library, and I'd just sit there after my shift and read and read and read. And she goes on to say, which meant I was getting a tad sleep deprived after about 6 months. And I decided at the tender age of 18 that I had to retire from the working world and take up this studying thing full time. So I decided, seeing how this was what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, that I would find a desert island and just move on onto it and study. That was all. It was so clear. It was just obvious. So Terry, with the help of one of her fisher friends, moved from Heron to Northwest Island, and that's when she encountered Barry Wayne. Here is the story she told me of Barry Wayne's article in her own words. So there I was on this beautiful island, and that's what I did. Every day I went out on the reef snorkelling and drawing pictures of fish, and all the money I had saved on Heron Island I bought reference books with, so I could identify fish, draw them, and start learning everything. And that's what I did. And that went on until there was, I don't know which newspaper, to this day I don't know which newspaper, but there was some press out on Heron Island at one point, and somebody let loose the fact that I was out on Northwest, and that started it all going downhill. I woke up with this person leaning over me, taking a picture of me in my sleeping bag in a little cot in the shack. Not even a knock on the door, just leaning over me with a camera. Rude bastard. He just came into my shack and pointed a camera down into my face. And I asked, did you say anything? And Terry says, I think my language back then was a little less salary than it is nowadays. I must agree it was certainly a good time for certainly a time for a good expletive. But I think I just burst into tears and went bush. I was too young and naive to hit him around the head with the closest heavy object. She continues that in the weeks that followed, one of my friends who was working behind the bar on nearby Heron Island said that I should go back go around to the back of the office where all the mail was sorted. That there was some mail for me, and there was this sack full of mail. Wayne's article had hit the press. Terry reflects and she says, "I had no idea what had happened, but apparently it hit the press both locally and overseas, including Stars and Stripes." That was a publication that went to the US soldiers in Vietnam. "It seemed it had a souped-up version of Tarzan Terry. So I had this gunny sack full of mail waiting for me. So I took my gunny sack full of mail." For Terry, the mail contained many a decent and indecent proposal. Word got out, and people came to her island, camping far too close. And we have moved a long way from a woman who just wanted to think and study fish. Terry left the island soon after on a research vessel, the Dante Deo, and spent the next 20 years on the ocean, barely setting foot on land. Her adventures were many, including collecting coral samples, which are now housed at the Smithsonian under her name. I had been on radio in the weeks that followed the State Library of Queensland announcement, and I told Terry how a journalist had asked how she felt about being called Tarzan Terry. And this is what she said to me. "From friends, I would tolerate it as being an effort to get a rise out of me because it would be done with humour and the best of intentions. From everybody else, I would find it both patronising and infuriating. How dare they define me by a tits and bum basic definition? Ridiculous. Ask me an important question. Ask me about something that matters. Ask me about what I am reading at the time. What was my music? What sort of art did I like? Who did I emulate? Who were my heroes? Ask me something important." And so we did, and will continue to do so, of Terry and the kaleidoscope of women, expertise and experience that has and continues to arrive. In Terry's story, we have a very different memory that speaks directly to the value of this project. The first draft of Terry's history in those newspapers varies markedly from her own recollection and adds much to our understanding of who this woman was and indeed is today. It is a great yarn, and Terry's story and our eventual discovery of her whereabouts generated a fair swathe of media interest, invitations and interest. We had many people approaching us to tell their story or alert us to the story of another. One of the first women we speak to in the wake of the fellowship announcement is Allison Rickett, who some may remember as Allison Dom. Allison completed a psychology and biological sciences degree at ANU and did her honours in biology, finishing in the late 1960s. She arrived on Heron Island first during her degree, invited by a friend, whose then boyfriend was a turtle researcher, to be a research assistant. While there, she met Steve Dom, and in Allison's own words, "It's a no-brainer, isn't it? Of course you want to come to the reef." Yes, I did that, and that's where I met Steve, and we fell in love. So we came back to Heron Island for a year because he was working as a research assistant to the director at that time. And then after that, of course, we were mixing with a lot of scientists, and they had a big contingent from the Australian Museum working on coral reef fishes. And they really wanted to set up a field station that they could use regularly because they were also building up collections of the reef fish that had never been studied. So they asked Steve and I if we would be interested if they put in a grant in going up and setting up the field station and doing research for them. So that's how we came to end up going to One Tree Island. There is much more to Allison's story, but for now, with Steve, she built foundations for the One Tree Island and the Lizard Island Research Station. The buildings that are there now are a story that can be told through the life of Allison Rickett. And this is our alley now. She reflects on her time on Heron, One Tree and Lizard. "I think I've had this most incredible opportunity. I've never thought much about what it meant that we took those first steps to create those two research stations, but going back and seeing what they've become and seeing the whole library full of research projects that have been done, seeing even the physical structure that's there, and to have laid that kind of foundation stone. I'm really proud of that. And the wonderful thing to see now is that when I went back to Lizard Island, it was full of women scientists. There were probably more females on the station doing research than males when I was there. And that was definitely not the case when I was there. So it's changed. The whole kind of capacity of women to be active and be on the reef in all sorts of ways. It's definitely changed for the better. Speaking of synergies. So now Allison Rickett lives near Terry, Ridgeway. Synergies, connections. Who incidentally lives not far from Carden Wallace, who is Emeritus Principal Scientist at Queensland Museum, amongst much else. Carden is also one of our Women of the Reef and features in the Queensland Review issue that we're launching later this evening, but you'll hear more of that later. So we arrange a meeting between Ali, we arrange a meeting with Ali and Terry, and we're all so excited to meet each other. And this is what that excitement really sounds like. Hello, Terry.
And
Hello.
excellent.
Hello.
You've put look at you.
Do I look all right, do I?
Yeah, no, it's just. Did you put a colour through it?
Oh.
I didn't remember it being that dark. It suits you.
Oh, thank you. Lovely to see you.
Too. I've got a koala's just been changing trees around the front there, so yeah, I know. Aren't I lucky?
That's real. And I might add that I've also done my hair tonight. Secret's out. In case you didn't catch it, Terry ends with "Aren't I lucky?" and the feeling is very much mutual. Allison, being the kind and thoughtful human she is, brings photos along to share with Terry and as reminders of their lives and where they were now, over half a century ago, living life young in the southern islands of the Great Barrier Reef, their paths nearly crossing then and wonderfully crossing now. She also brings a sound recording of the mutton birds on Heron Island that she wants to play for Terry. We play Terry the sound of the mutton birds. I'll never forget the look on Terry's face when she heard that sound. She turned to look at me, and in her face was that young woman in her 20s, now in her mid-70s, living her dream life, learning, exploring, and certain of her path. It was just so powerful. The extraordinary Isabel Bennett, our first reef scientist. Anyone who's done any reef science since has stood on the massive shoulders of Izzy Bennett. She writes of these mutton birds too. In her seminal book, The Great Barrier Reef, Isabel Bennett writes, "As darkness falls, it is suddenly as though the demons of hell were let loose. The courting of these birds, the ghostly, weird and most deafening caterwauling, which begins and continues interminably through the night, can only be appreciated by those who have experienced it. Standing among the trees, one is likely to be bombarded on all sides as small black objects come hurtling in. Without a torch, there is every possibility that something soft and living may be crushed underfoot. But with the first light of dawn, the foraging partners silently set out to the sea. Peace reigns for another day." In more recent writing, Tart, reef royalty with a lifetime of dedication and distinguished contribution to reef conservation, writes of these mutton birds too in her contribution to our special issue. When asked to draw on an object or memory to stimulate her personal reflection on the reef, she invokes her memory of the Heron Island mutton birds. She writes, "It was the early 1980s on a warm summer's evening on Northwest Island in the Capricornia Bunker Group towards the southern end of the Great Barrier Reef. I had some time to myself and was wandering along the beach at sunset. Looking up, I realised there were thousands and thousands, if not hundreds and thousands, of birds, wedge-tailed shearwaters in fact, circling the island as they returned to their underground nest and to mate after a day of feeding and cruising the air currents. So what was so special, you may ask? This happens every summer's evening on many reef sandcays. For me, it was special because I suddenly realised that this huge sweep of birds was flying past in total silence. The only sound was an occasional wing dipping into the sea." And Di continues, "Anyone who has spent any time in summer on the southern reef vegetated sandcays will regale you with stories of the moaning shearwaters. It goes on all night and can be the making of nightmares. Yet here they were in their teeming thousands in total silence. It's not often that silence is a fond memory of the reef. Generally there's always something happening either above or below water. More often, silence is a harbinger of a problem as happened when I went snorkelling on reefs off Cairns after the 2016 mass coral bleaching event." Now that our mutton birds are lined up, we can see the shared experience, sounds and absence of sound, of memory, of smell, of life and our relations to other life, of a life well lived. And in these stories and their common memories, we start to think about the reef in ways that disrupt the usual, of often competing reef science, politics and industry, and we bring to the fore different ways of communicating the reef, ways of remembering the reef that enrich our understanding of it and ourselves as its human community and our relations to it. The rationale is that the reef is much more than a scientific object. It is this, but this nature superstar is importantly and critically a product of our cultural imagination. The reef carries much more than its extraordinary biodiversity, its role in planetary health and so on. For Australians and Queenslanders, it carries our love and revere of our big nature, of how we imagine ourselves here and globally, because we love a sunburnt country. As a nation where nature is prized, how we communicate the Great Barrier Reef and how we remember the reef matters to our understanding of ourselves in the past and importantly has ramifications for our future. And now, when as all our women and other experts have noticed, climate change is its biggest threat, it is well documented that women will experience climate change impacts in ways that augment existing disadvantage and also create new pressures. And the United Nations Framework on Climate Change cites women in leadership positions as integral to climate change responses. In 2014, the United Nations Framework on Convention on Climate Change established the Lima Work Programme on Gender to acknowledge as much. Later in 2017, developing the Gender Action Plan to address the underrepresentation of women in climate change decision making, including its own. More than ever, as our Val Plumwood wrote 30 years ago, we need to tell different stories that can lead us on different paths. As feminist Anne Summers has noted, a profound ignorance about the roles of women has pervaded Australian history, leading to a suppression of their contribution in the telling of the nation's history. Precisely because of this struggle for social equality and women's historical influence upon and contributions to reef conservation have been overshadowed or ignored, we offer this project in counterpoint. Our research has revealed that women of many walks of life have made landmark contributions to reef knowledge, regulation and protection during this period, participating both as individuals and through collective action in urban, regional and remote parts of the state. Their interventions range from the crucial voices of First Nations women to the endeavours of female researchers in a variety of disciplines, from the remarkable effort of environmental activists, artists and journalists to the progressive struggles of women in business, public service and the unions, and more. And these are some of our women of the reef that we're already spoken to. Rosemary Hill, our reef scientist at James Cook University, Pat Mather, extraordinary reef scientist, pioneering, and we have people like Zara Holt and Alison Bust who are involved in the early Save the Reef campaign. And here are some more. Sheridan Morris, who is the current director of the Reef and Rainforest Centre at Reef and Rainforest Research Centre in Cairns. The late but great Flick Wishart, who led the Fight for the Reef campaign taken from us too early. Of course, Judith Wright and Chrissy Grant, a First Nations woman. Within the library's collection, several holdings relate to the formation and history of the Great Barrier Reef Committee, as well as activism of the Queensland Littoral Society. We look forward to smooth sailing in the absence of pandemics and natural disasters to better explore these. And collections elsewhere, including, of course, the National Library and many others that have the history of women's contributions in these domains. By retelling modern reef history through women's experiences and achievements, we amplify the voices, experiences and expertise of women on reef matters, and by extension and translation throughout Australian society, remembering and respect. And as this artwork from Yo Oakley from Malakuta so beautifully evokes, in telling the story of our women through the mutton bird, we begin to challenge the ways we think of ourselves in relation to the reef. And therein lies hope and change. We are eternally grateful to the State Library of Queensland for this John Oxley Library Fellowship and for their support of our project. After quite the recent history, we are still here and will continue to work with our now friends at the John Oxley on our Women of the Reef project. And there is a broader story to be told about environmental conservation in Queensland that we will also pursue. We have collected a dozen women's stories so far, and we'll prepare these Women of the Reef stories for submission to the John Oxley. We have many more to come, and this is an ongoing project, so the John Oxley Library have not seen the last of us yet. We have plans for books and a podcast, and there is an opportunity to expand this project. So while we have your attention, we are seeking funding for phase 2, and all inquiries are most welcome. Heartfelt thank you to our Women of the Reef and their supporters, to the State Library of Queensland and John Oxley, especially Chrissy Theodoso. I know I've butchered that, sorry Chrissy. Tamara Crew and Troy Keith. And thank you all for listening here and online, and we look forward to sharing more with you in the years to come. Thank you.
It's like choosing your cutlery. It's like which side do you... Yeah. Oh, that was amazing. Thank you. Thanks so much, Kerrie. So I'd just like to welcome Kerrie and the famous Deb, who was mentioned, research partner in this project. I think we have the Slido link, which it's a QR code. So hopefully everyone is well aware of QR codes now, which we should be able to pop up. So if you follow that link that the QR code takes it to, you can submit a question through the platform. So we're in a library which is a safe haven for introverts. So if you do incline to introversion, this is a good way to put your questions to Kerrie and Deb. So we can read them out now, and then also there might be a little bit of a flow on after the panel discussion as well in a couple of minutes. But I was really struck by a presentation, Kerrie, and you know, it's my pleasure to kind of see fellows doing research in the fellowship lounge or coming in and doing things. But you have that kind of crystallizing moment when you see the presentation and you get it. You're like, oh yeah, you know, that all, like, it all, the penny dropped. And I think you used that line of investigation of how we communicate the reef. And I think that was a really point that I found very profound, because so often when people are talking about the reef, they're doing when they're not connected to it, like they're away from it and they're apart from it. And a lot of the discussion about the reef misses those personal stories that you've obviously kind of drawn out, and it's so emotional to kind of to see the, you know, it's like seeing the end of a movie. Like, you're like, is Terry okay? You know, is it going to be okay? Like, I want to know it's okay before I commit to this. And that brings to life that this natural wonder is so amazing that somebody can literally spend their life kind of dedicated to investigating it. And you can sort of be told all of these things, whether it's through scientific data or, you know, sort of documentaries and whatnot, but it's actually pulling through the heart and the feeling and the emotion of what this natural resource is capable of, that really, I think, gives it a deeper understanding and a bit of a deeper meaning of why this is such an important thing worthy of our attention. So long-winded question, but that sort of tension between the arts and the humanities and the sciences, is that something that you had to contend with in your project?
It's something that's very much central to our project. When we communicate the reef, we cause it to exist. You know, how we think about it and how we communicate it brings it into existence, and that's why communication is so central to our project, and thinking about how the reef has been communicated and how it might be communicated in different ways, so that we might expand our horizons and our options available. So the reef is very much a scientific object, and without science we wouldn't know the health of the reef. There's a lot of things we wouldn't know about the reef without science. But there's also other ways of knowing the reef and understanding the reef that also cause it to come into existence. For us to also be able to, you know, communicate those different ways of knowing and understanding the reef is important, and serves to support the science. So that it's not so much a division so much as it's finding a way in which you can support our science colleagues and our women reef scientists by telling the sorts of stories that we told tonight, and also acknowledging that those stories are also enough on their own, that they have meaning above and beyond what we might know of the science of the reef. Deb?
I think you nailed it, Gavin. That's exactly... I remember when Kerrie first spoke to me about the project, and it was the way she communicated it to me, the way it became a story straight away. And I could see, so what I do in my own work has always been about anchored in oral history, which is about, you know, spending a lot of time with people, getting to know them over time, really grappling with the context in which their story comes about, and then thinking carefully about the way they tell their story and what it means for them and how that can shift over time too. And I could see that straight away when you started talking about the project, and so it's become a real privilege, I think, to be recording these stories, and then to get to sort of wade around in that context for years, hopefully, to come.
Definitely, I think that sensitivity, you know, if somebody, like your sensitivity and ability to listen deeply with the contributors comes through in those outcomes so much. And that presentation is just just by seeing that, it really comes through so clearly. This is maybe a bit of an awkward segue, but we have an anonymous question of, have you seen a shift in the types of research being conducted by women versus men? And is there, I suppose, reflecting on those differences, and is there a gender bias?
Which type of research? do they mean? Does that anonymous scientific?
I mean, yeah. There we go. Yeah.
I just read an article today talking about researchers looking at bird song, and that almost everyone thought it was just males that sang in the bird world. And it's now that we have female researchers working in that space, they're like, hell, female birds sing as well. And if you look at all the research that's now being done on female bird song, it's all being done by women. And I would be sort of fascinated to know whether, the women doing research in the reef have sort of changed the focus of what they see, because they're looking at it with a different set of eyes versus a lot of the male researchers.
That's a really good question. It's certainly something that we ask the women that we speak to, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of consensus.
No, but I guess that we tread lightly because there's lots of ways of being a woman in the world, and if you're a woman who's particularly who has a particular love or a penchant for what might be traditionally known, or we might assume as a more male, masculine part of science, then I'm just cautious not to, so this is a women's way of doing reef research, and this is a men's way of doing reef research. I know you didn't mean that, but it is a question. We've asked the women about whether they think women have a different relationship with the reef. And there are different responses. Some people would absolutely agree, some women would absolutely agree with that proposition that, there's more of a sort of a feminine, maternal sort of nurturing instinct to their relationship, and others would say not so much. So, it's a good question, not easily answered.
This is a popular question on the channel. What did the women you interviewed say about reef bleaching, and what's their thoughts on the long-term outlook of the reef?
Well, it's kind of the title of the Queensland Review special issue, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. The women, everyone's aware of mass coral bleaching and the impacts of climate changes on the Great Barrier Reef. People like, I'm thinking about Carden Wallace, who's doing study on corals that are deeper on the Great Barrier Reef. She finds some hope in that work. We also found people who were very proud and about what had occurred so far on the reef, and that level of commitment and the amount of work that had been done was also a cause for some hope that we could turn things around. Maybe not the way in which the reef looks now, certainly not the way the reef has looked 50 years ago, but there was hope in amongst the women's responses, even given the mass coral bleachings. And I would say too that for us too, despair's indulgent a little bit. For us, we have to have hope. We can't enter into these conversations. We both work as academics and living a fairly privileged life. So whilst we can, we'll have hope, and our women that we've encountered so far certainly felt the same.
Last question, and it's probably a bit of that question of what next in the next generation. Do you have plans or ideas for making use of these inspiring stories of female scientists and activists with schools and young women?
What a great idea.
That's a good idea. Who said that? Really good idea.
Maybe somebody to collaborate with, sounds?
Yeah, and I suppose it relates to your previous question about despair. You have young people who are counting on us. So it's important that we provide avenues for them to pursue hope and to pursue a future. Deb?
And we've been very conscious of including younger voices, as some younger women working on the reef up out of Port Douglas. We were talking to some women up there, and you know, we're really conscious of trying to, well, I guess give them some space to air that frustration and that despair, and hope at the same time. Yeah.
Okay. Well, on that hopeful note, thank you. But wait, there's more. That we also have now a panel discussion, an official launch of the Queensland Review issue. So I'm going to slide out of here and welcome the panel to the tub chairs.
Get this right now.
Everybody right? In a wonderful evening of celebrating all that is Queensland nature, I also have the great pleasure to officially launch this special edition of Queensland Review, edited by myself and Professor Emeritus Ian McElmain at the end there. Between Pride and Despair, stories of the Great Barrier Reef and wet tropics rainforest. For mine, and Ian will provide some final reflections in his concluding remarks, I'm just a little bit unsure about how I came to share the company of these most outstanding contributors. Rarely, and I know Ian agrees, have we encountered such beautiful, exceptional, thought-provoking and intelligent writing. Our congratulations and thanks to our wonderful writers for their time and dedication to what became quite a long process with COVID and the floods and whatnot. And also a big thank you to Joanne Hook, who is also one of our Women of the Reef, for the permission to use her art, Reef and Rainforest, as our front cover. The volume is a mix of scholarly articles and personal reflections, bookended with reflections from Juru traditional owner and artist Leonard Andy and Chrissy Grant, an Eastern Kuku Yalanji and Torres Strait Islander Elder Murgal from Moa Island. As First Nations people with deep connections to far north Queensland country, the reflections rightfully launch our issue and demonstrate the enduring power of their cultural science and practice, and how these have also sometimes become enmeshed with Western systems of knowledge and management. It is with a great sense of pride that we present to you the tapestry of these stories of the Great Barrier Reef and wet tropics rainforest, where personal reflections are interwoven with scholarly essays to showcase a broader humanity of environmental care. Our scholarly analyses are ranged beside the private memories of individuals who have dedicated lifetimes to conserving and protecting these two natural wonders. And we hope that this approach dilutes some of the arbitrary divisions between ourselves and nature and captures something of the resulting richness and complexity of human and non-human relationships. And tonight we're fortunate to have 4 of our authors here. And by way of a hopelessly inadequate introduction, and my apologies for brevity, I'll start with Deb Anderson, who, as you know, is my co-fellow on the Women of the Reef project. Deb is a journalist and academic at Monash University and a true far north Queensland local. Her work marries oral history, journalism and ecofeminism. Sitting beside Deb is Di Tart, who wrote a personal reflection that you heard about earlier, and so she also notices mutton birds in her personal reflection, which is Sounds of Silence, and has since the 1970s been involved in advocating for protection of the Great Barrier Reef. Beside Di is Peter McCallum, and is by his own admission a jack of all trades, who has been involved with the Mackay Conservation Group since 1993 and is currently their group coordinator. And finally, last but certainly not least, my co-editor, Professor Ian McElmain. Ian is an environmental historian, Professor Emeritus at ANU and the University of Sydney. He's the author of many things, but his 2014 book, The Reef, A Passionate History From Cook to Climate Change, is what brought him to me. So thanks to you all for participating, and we're just going to ask some questions to highlight some of the themes of the issue. To you, Di, first. Amongst much else, you have been responsible for the reef report cards, so critical to understanding our reef health. The reef report cards prioritise the natural and environmental sciences, but tonight, can we ask you to please reflect on the humanities, creative arts and social sciences showcased in our special issue, and offer any thoughts on their report cards and their historical and future contribution to reef health. Over to you, Di.
That was a long one.
I know.
Thanks, Kerrie. My first observation is I hate thinking of arts, science and humanities within the construct of report cards, because they are fairly rigid, and that's the one thing that we don't want in terms of arts, science and humanities. We want the full spectrum. But also reflect that without the arts, and humanities, we probably wouldn't have had a Great Barrier Reef campaign, because it was Judith Wright who led the charge, and John Buist from Ninny Rise, who was an artist previously on Badara, I do believe. So it was their social conscience that triggered and in fact dragged the scientists kicking and screaming into the wonderful world of politics and the reef, which is really the world that I've lived in for the last too many years. So to answer your question, I actually think it's a pleasure to dip into the review, and I don't say that because it includes something that I had spent a little time from, because it gave me pause to reflect on a whole range of issues that are in fact bubbling up, that despite the glimmer of hope, and I'd say it's more a glimmer of hope than a large fire of hope about the reef, we are actually entering an era of significant change. And some of the ethical questions that are actually raised by a number of the authors are actually really pertinent to what's actually being considered as about potential interventions to actually improve the likelihood of hope for the reef, particularly if we want to see a reef that is in the form and function a little bit similar to what it is today. So there's some very important underlying ethical questions that we as a society need to consider, and this is a really good entry into them. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thanks, Di. Deb, over to you now. You've spent your whole life in and around Cairns and the far north of Queensland, growing up on the tablelands. Your academic work as a journalist and oral historian has provided opportunities to delve deeper into your own Queensland heritage, the people and communities. Can you tell us about the work you do in the humanities, arts and social sciences, and why oral history has been your chosen method of engagement with the reef and the rainforest?
Oh, that's a good question. Thanks, Kerrie. I think it's a privilege to do oral history, and all of the work that I've done has been uses or draws upon oral history methods. Yep, I grew up north, and in the 70s, in fact, the article that we wrote for this edition, which is about Carden Wallace, she was just at in the 70s, she was going up there hunting for a boat that would take her out. And in this edition, her oral history she shared with us about how, hard it was to get someone to take a woman out on a boat back when she first went up there, when she was working at Queensland Museum, and she'd go up there hunting for a boat that would take out her research team. And so, I grew up in a very different kind of far north Queensland at the same time, kind of growing up and you don't know what you don't know, but many years later left North Queensland to get an education. Like many rural regional people, you have to go away to go to university. Went to UQ, which is where Carden had been herself. But anyway, so I end up all these years later working down south in a big university, and I keep gravitating back up north to do research up there. I think it's got a real pull. Most of the oral history I've been doing over the past 8 years has actually been about the lived experience of a cyclone. I think the way that people talk about their experience of extreme weather in North Queensland and that idea of being bred tough, I'm really fascinated by that. I'm really fascinated by the purchase of that, by how strongly people can identify with that idea, and also how that's shifted over time. So I love to do longitudinal projects that can take me back and ask someone the same question again. So, you know, how do you think about cyclones now? Do you think these are more frequent or severe, or, you know, those kinds of questions? And they will they'll answer that or respond to it in the context of their own lived experience of the next cyclone that's come along. So it might have been Larry in 2006, followed by Yassi in 2011. And so there's that kind of building on their own lived experience and the way that they think about the world that they live in and what climate change means in that context. And I think that's, it's a privilege to be in that space, but I think it's also really valuable because it's about how people should be given an opportunity to change their mind over time, and that history isn't fixed, right? Like that people have an opportunity to learn and to change their story. Yeah.
Wow, great. Both of your responses really drawing upon those sort of human dimensions of, you know, the Great Barrier Reef and wet tropics, which are so central to the review issue. Peter, waiting patiently there. You've been volunteering at the Mackay Conservation Group since the early 90s, a conservation group that has led actions to stop the Adani mine and mitigate the impacts of mining on the reef and the entire planet. Your personal reflection in the specialist issue is about the damming of Urena Creek, west of Mackay. Why is Urena Creek important in the context of our reef and rainforests?
Well, it's a big, a big story about climate change. I suppose in relation to the reef, we probably think of it as colour. You know, it's all that beauty of, you know, animal and coral that is it has an antithesis in a lack of colour that comes through the bleaching events that have happened in the past 20 years. So I think my personal experience of the reef was taking my son diving at Bowen, or just snorkeling, and you know, him just popping his head out of the water, and, you know, like I just saw an octopus swim past me, and bands of colour flowed through its body, and we're surrounded by all these fish, and you know, it was such a profound experience for him and for me. And then later on, I was lucky enough to get a job, a paid job at Mackay Conservation Group, and met a diver called Tony Fonts, who has been very active in campaigning on reef and climate change issues. And he says, look, the reef isn't just the coral; it's the blue highway. And so then that leads to, you know, like the discovery of this place called Urena Creek through a photographer, and discovering that there's all this green there as well. There's this beautiful rainforest at Youngla where the winds, the trade winds that blow across the Pacific, make their way across Yui country at Mackay, up into the rainforest at Whitty country, and drop their water, which flows through the rainforest down into Urena Creek. And that, you know, is just this perfect place of, you know, like crystal clear water. It's home to a species of turtle that Steve Irwin discovered 30 years ago. You know, it's got all these fantastic features about it. And then this proposal comes along that that some people want to dam that creek and use it to wash coal, which will help facilitate, you know, further burning of coal, which will lead to the reef being bleached even more severely and more often. So I suppose that place to me is important, although I've never visited it. I have, through all these sorts of people's stories about the place, I've learned a lot about Urena, and I feel very invested in helping prevent that dam going ahead, and we're very hopeful that as a result of the change in the federal government that that project may be stopped, but we still have a lot of work to do in that way.
It's those specificities of connections, that are unseen. So much of what we see is on the reef, but drawing attention to those catchments is so important, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Ian, Di, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say it's H2O, hills tops to ocean.
Great. Hills tops to ocean.
Hilltops to ocean.
That's it.
The underpinning of our life, water.
Back again.
Yep.
Finally, Ian, you have spent many years in Bingle Bay, especially at John and Alison Buse's house, Ninny Rise, where the 1960s campaign to defend the reef against oil exploration and drilling was hatched. And Di's made mention of that in her response, with Judith Wright, Len Webb and many others. Over 50 years later, and in light of your epilogue in the Queensland Review issue about the Cassowary Coast, can you talk to the challenges and opportunities that confront reef communities? Where might we find hope and despair? And what is the contribution of the humanities, creative arts and social sciences in securing either?
Wow, that's a lot. I want to just actually focus on the last two words that you said, hope and despair, because I think there's a really important story to be told, which is a story about actually women transcending men. Because what happened with the despair syndrome, particularly among scientists, was that it was very much connected first to men who were in charge of major scientific enterprises, in the Barrier Reef in particular. And the problem was really that the Barrier Reef is so vast that any small amounts of repair work or restoration or anything seems pointless. And so you got a kind of despair or a kind of rhetoric that simply said, look, the reef is just too big. There's no point trying to fiddle around with it. The only thing you can do is hope for emissions to be reduced. And if emissions aren't being reduced, then the only thing to do is despair. Instead, what happened was there were two women, one in particular, Ruth Gates, who was a scientist working in Hawaii with the smaller reefs there. And she's died unfortunately, but she was an incredibly tough lady. She had a black belt in karate, and she took no prisoners. And she said, look, there are other reefs, and as far as I'm concerned, we can do something with these reefs here in this part of the world, in Hawaii. And Madeleine Van Oppen, another friend of hers, got together. She works here in Australia. And the two of them then launched an enterprise to do restoration work on reefs. And that now has kind of changed, I think, the disposition of scientists all over the world. Because one of the things that happened when they did this was that people started to feel in some way absolutely filled with a desire to do something instead of despairing. It changed the way people responded. And that's happened now. Madeleine Van Oppen is in charge of the largest enterprise in the world, really, to try and make reefs able to deal with heat and able to deal with acidification. Now that's happening here in Australia. She's had a lot of money, a lot of support. They're doing it through accelerated evolution. And hope has returned. Even if it isn't the reef we know now, some reef might survive if we work on it. And if it doesn't survive, we'll at least have got together areas of coral that you can then use to replace it. So I guess my long and short story is a story of women transforming the scene by their determination to hope rather than despair.
Lovely, thank you, Anne. Did you want to say anything about the humanities, arts and social sciences at all, being an environmental historian, my friend?
Yes. Well, I mean, obviously, I'm a historian and a writer, but I'm also somebody who was involved at Sydney University with setting up a multidisciplinary environmental centre. And the whole point of a multidisciplinary environmental centre is because we believed that you cannot solve a complex and wicked problem like the Great Barrier Reef unless every discipline, and I mean every discipline, is engaged. And that came out of the humanities and social sciences, but we ended up, and that centre still operates, working with people from every discipline on projects. And the discrimination or the discrepancy, I suppose, between humanities, social science, art, science, biology, law, and so on, it just disappeared. It disappeared because we were trying to solve particular problems. And that's what I think our role is now. Our role is to work together. And so the humanities and social sciences have, as far as I'm concerned, a need to get together with people in other disciplines to help solve this, the biggest problem we face.
Wonderful, thank you. Before I open up to some audience Q&A, some questions from the audience, can I ask you all briefly, and in whatever order, thinking about the Queensland review issue, are there any sort of standout moments for you that, you know, in the articles and the personal reflections that are at the top of your list? Were there moments that you read things and you thought hope, and others you read and you thought, oh goodness, despair? Anybody can go first. They're studying. It's not an open book exam.
No, it's
A knee-jerk reaction.
my disposition, and I am going to say something about this when I just wind up the thing at the end, is to say that the most important thing about this particular, I think this particular approach is precisely that it has two different kinds of enterprises contained in there. Some are academic work by very, very clever and knowledgeable people who specialise in particular things, and others are the reflections by people who have lived and worked with environments on the ground, like Peter here. People who have actually been at the front, I think, at the front line of the enterprise. Many of them are not necessarily scientists, but they're people who have worked there, and the reflections of those alongside with the scientific work, I think, transforms the importance of the journal.
I agree. Peter, Di?
I enjoyed actually catching up with Carden, and I know Carden, but I don't know Carden really well, but it was lovely dipping into your article, yours and Deb's, about Carden, then interweaving what you're going to do with the whole Women of the Great Barrier Reef program. So that, to my mind, was one of the highlights, but there are lots of highlights in this thing. I learnt a lot and caused me to think a lot. So thank you.
Thank you.
I was just amazed at the process, really, of how this, like, people who are looking at this will see, you know, just a journal, but having been sort of on the inside a bit, and watching the way that this was put together, you know, and there were so many issues along the way in terms of putting it together. I think it's you know, it's an amazing effort it's been produced. So that's
yes, we certainly had our fair share of challenges. It looks all seamless and pretty now, but geez. Deb?
I would second what you're saying, Peter. I mean, for those of us who work in higher education, like it's really difficult to pull off something this beautiful. Like, there is a lot of pressure to go for particular journals, you know, with a particular ranking and the international, and if a particular journal doesn't make the list of whatever discipline you're in or whatever university you're working at, like, you know, you're encouraged to overlook those kinds of opportunities, which can lead to beautiful outcomes like this, where there are personal reflections from people, including Women of the Reef, and you know, people like Di and Peter are in here as well, alongside those kind of careful, more studious engagements with reef and rainforest research. Yes, and for myself personally, so yeah, we wrote a piece together with Anne Leach. We wrote a piece on kind of centering on Carden Wallace's story. Can I share a little bit of her story, just really quickly?
She's gone rogue.
Just
yes,
really quickly.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm just going to read you a tiny bit. So Carden Wallace fondly recalls being there that exciting night when the moon was right and the scientists first witnessed the mass spawning of coral in 1981. The first year we saw coral spawning, Wallace says, we were on Magnetic Island and everybody had sort of predicted when it was going to happen, but it kept not happening. Having followed the clues but been made to wait, most of the team of researchers had dispersed. Quote, some of the people had to go home, she recalls, yet Wallace and one other James Cook University scientist opted to stay behind on the beach that night. And Wallace tells us, I had my kids with me at the time, so I'm sitting on the beach in the middle of the night and he, the other scientist, was just snorkelling. It's quite shallow. Then he stands up and is making all these noises through his snorkel, screaming out. And they're all spawning and everything was spawning, just going off. I had to wait until he came back up and say, don't you leave my kids, before she got her chance to go in the water. I had to go in by myself. And so, you know, then we go on to kind of analyse her story and think about it in historical context and think about all the challenges that she faced in doing the incredible research that she did through her career. And then, you know, up against it, we've got this beautiful reflection by Carden Wallace where she talks about how they used, you know, the Queenslanders' form of, you know, kind of taking all your equipment down to study the reef was just to use a shopping basket. And so I never thought to ask her that question, right? I never thought to ask her what did she use. And so I actually learnt something that I found really interesting from reading her piece, which I think is really kind of prosaic and just beautiful. Yeah. It's really hard to do this, I think, kind of work. We're increasingly difficult. So, yeah, great that you've done it.
Yeah, great. We're in great company. Every personal reflection, every article that came through, I was like, wow, this person's amazing. You know, there was so much really fantastic work. I particularly liked Bill Wilkie's personal reflection about the Daintree blockade, and he uses the radio log of the protesters up in the trees to stimulate his reflection. It's just a wonderful insight into how that protest played out literally on the ground and up in the trees. So that was probably one of my highlights, and really the whole volume is a highlight for me, and each individual piece carries with it something quite exceptional. We're all right for time, Gavin?
Yes. I think there's a few questions.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so we have a couple of questions from the audience. I'll go to the first one, which is popular, from Bianca Milroy. And Bianca asks, what advice do you have for writers wanting to engage more in environmental advocacy and also applying for a fellowship with the State Library? Deb?
I can answer the last part of that question. The State Library have been absolutely fabulous to work with, considering that we've had little opportunity over the last couple of years to actually get in here into the library and do the work that we had promised we were going to do. And they've been so incredibly supportive. I guess when we were putting together our application, we thought carefully about engaging with Queensland history and Queensland culture. Like, we really thought carefully about that. And, you know, Kerrie had this great idea anyway about the women of the reef. I think that idea sold itself, but we came into the library before we submitted the application in 2020, and we spent a bit of time going through the collections. And so there is, you know, finding specific holdings and finding the names of specific women who were going to be the starting point for our application. So we could identify that Isabel Bennett, Anne Carden-Wallace, and a couple of other women. Pat Mather, yes. Paulette McWilliam from CSIRO. There's a few that we could identify had been really influential in the domains of those holdings, like the formation of the Great Barrier Reef Committee, the Queensland Littoral Society. Yes, so we spoke to the collections as well. I found that was really important. I can hand over, perhaps to Di or Peter, for the other part of the question.
I forget what the first part was.
Well, it's how may these stories permeate?
No, it was about writing and
writing and
environmental
advocacy.
advocacy.
Well, there's plenty of.
I'd suggest volunteering for an environmental advocate organisation. They're always looking for people who can write.
Yeah.
In part.
And I think, people with skills in writing, probably looking for outlets and we'd welcome people to do that in our organisation, and there are many along the coast of Queensland that would definitely benefit from people who can tell stories in a way that that engage with tell personal stories, I suppose, not so much as facts and figures or scientific papers are great, but they don't really reach people's hearts. So that's the main thing, I think.
Telling those human stories are very important. I guess too, from there's volunteering and supporting volunteer organisations, but there's more than one way to write. And so even if you're writing, it might be a policy brief, or you might be writing a journal. It might be a journalist, or you might be volunteering for an organisation, writing grant applications, or helping with their media content. It's all ways of writing to support and foster more positive environmental outcomes. I think we actually have to wind things up because we've run out of time. But before we do so, Ian, I was going to pass to you to make some concluding remarks.
Sure. Thank you very much. I'll just walk round to the here. Well, I'd like to take this occasion to thank Griffith University and its super agent, Kerrie Foxwell-Norton, great friend and inspirer. I'd also like to thank those here today, or those who are elsewhere scattered around Australia, who've contributed to this, I think, extraordinary collection. It's described technically as a special issue, and I think for once the term special really means something. I think the issue is exceptional and unusual and original precisely because, as we've been saying, and you've seen examples of it here, we combine the research of expert scientists with people who have lived and engaged themselves on the ground with challenges and with battles of an environmental kind. And this interweaving of that two different kinds of experience and two different kinds of knowledge makes this a very unusual and, I think, exceptional journal. I think it also is important, and it struck me quite strongly, is that the issues in this journal are not, they do not tell the end of the story. They open up a whole series of engagements with the environment, I think, for Queenslanders and for other people that are going on at the same time, so that the journal fertilises one's other projects. And you've heard that tonight with the wonderful description of the Women of the Reef project, which is one of the subjects discussed here, but opens up something really large and really exciting that Kerrie and Deb have been talking about. I've had a similar kind of experience myself. I'm writing a biography at the moment about John Buist, one of the key figures, along with his wife Allison and in fact his sister Phyllis, who helped to save the reef in 1970 when it had been zoned, 80% of it had been zoned by Joe Bjelke-Petersen for oil and gas mining. And the inspiration of this journal has helped me in writing this memoir. Likewise, I've just come a few days ago from Mission Beach, where I'm working with two extraordinary women on a valiant, I think, conservationist program, which is engaged in protecting the reef and the rainforest in a particular way. On the 24th and 25th of September, we're inviting both the public and specialised experts to discuss and debate and communicate how we can face up to the challenges that face the last stand of southern cassowaries in Australia, the last large stand of southern cassowaries in Australia. How will we learn to live with them? How will we learn to live with them at a time when they're being decimated by deforestation and development? And our event will be held in John Buist's house. It's echoed and foreshadowed, I suppose, in this particular journal. Around a month ago, I also found myself in the position of drawing extensively on the contents of this journal when acting as a respondent to a world-famous US environmental writer, the science writer for the journal, and she's called Elizabeth Colbert. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner. Her two recent books have all sold 10 million copies. She is, in effect, I think, the most influential modern environmentalist in the world. And she was giving lectures on our Great Barrier Reef and our rainforests and our rapidly disappearing species. I thus had the opportunity to urge Elizabeth to read this special issue from Queensland and incorporate it in her original findings when she goes out to influence the rest of the world. So I want to thank you all for coming here, thank the people who wrote it for their contributions. We've all of the writers will get a copy of this. We've asked the publisher to send them along as mementos for them. And while we wait for these to arrive, in the meantime, I urge you to maintain your rage about the environment, to retain your passion and your compassion for our blighted planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you for all our speakers, Kerrie, Deb, Diane and Peter. So thank you. Round of applause again. Thank you. So this event has been live streamed. So people have been watching this. Hello to those people who've been watching from their kitchens. One comment just on the Facebook stream was from somebody who commended the fabulous Val Plumwood quote and our dog is very taken with the mutton bird sounds. It's nice that the message is getting out there. It's also being recorded, this the talk today, so if anybody you know missed it and didn't have the chance to watch it, it'll be available pretty soon through our website as well. Few quick plugs. We have tomorrow, there was a discussion with Deb and Kerrie about advice for aspiring fellows, and I acknowledge that tomorrow we will have a fellowship information night for anybody who is wanting to take up that opportunity of being a fellow at State Library of Queensland. We have a range of fellowships totalling, I think it's about $85,000 is the breadth of the program that we're offering. And you can come along tomorrow, again, in person or online, to ask questions through Slido if you want, or in person, about how you might submit an application. Applications are open now and they close on the 15th of July. So I encourage anybody with an interest in Queensland history to submit an application. That's enough from me. I'd like to conclude the events for today. There will be drinks and refreshments around the corner on the Queensland Terrace, so State Library staff can direct you there. So there'll be drinks and refreshments, and also copies of the review, the Queensland Review, the special edition will be on sale as well for you to be able to take home. So I encourage you to spend some time and mingle outside, and thank you very much for coming. Have a good night.
Thank you.